You know, I first heard about the Hertz Foundation probably 45 years ago, and there were all kinds of interesting people that I knew, and I happened to hear, oh, they had some Hertz Fellowship thing. I hadn't really quite put all of it together until I think sometime after Elise and I got married 30 years ago now. I kind of learned she was also one of these Hertz Fellow people. Anyway, very nice to have a chance to talk to you all. Well, I thought what I would try and do is talk about kind of a 50-year span of kind of my adventures in kind of the computational paradigm, some of the things that have happened and I think are going to happen, and hopefully I'll get to something a result that I just got yesterday. So we'll see whether I can get to that. Let me start with something a long time ago. I was a kid in England, got interested in physics when I was 10 or 11 years old, and sometime in June of 1972, I bought myself a book about statistical physics. And I got very interested in this, and I really liked the cover of the book, which is an illustration of kind of the molecules, idealized molecules bouncing around, illustrating the second law of thermodynamics. And I thought I should really try and understand this, and I should try and, my first big effort in computing was trying to simulate that picture. I did it on this computer here. It was about the size of a desk. It wasn't successful, actually. I didn't manage to reproduce that picture. As I learned a decade later, I actually had produced something more interesting. But perhaps one thing that's of Hertz relevance, going back to this picture here, is the origin of that actual picture on the book. The picture was made in 1960 at Lawrence Livermore Lab by a chap called Bernie Alder, who had been recruited to Lawrence Livermore in 1955 by Edward Teller to work on kind of high-density materials and so on. And actually, the computer, I have a picture here of the computer on which that book cover was made. In those days, the desk came with the computer. That was a thing called the LARC, the Livermore Advanced Research Computer. And that was, I think I have another picture here. That's a picture of the people who made that picture with physicists with ties and so on, which was the case in those days. In any case, so got me started on being interested started using computers to try and understand things about science. And I worked on particle physics, things like that. I was kind of confused by why other people didn't use computers to do these kinds of things. I started using computers to do kind of mathematical calculations because I thought the mathematical calculations were kind of boring and mechanical and they should be delegated to computers. Kind of one of the things I learned at that time was, you know, there are tools, but people don't always use them. If you do use them, you have great leverage. Well, after studying particle physics and cosmology and so on in the 1970s, late 1970s, which was a great time because it was sort of the golden age of particle physics and quantum field theory and so on, I got interested in sort of the general question of how complexity arises in the world. And that got me interested in kind of, well, how can you make models of things like that? And so I tried using sort of mathematical equations, things like that. Didn't work very well. I started thinking, you know, what is the most general kind of medium that we can use to make models of things? And started thinking about sort of, if you just specify rules for something, what do those rules specify that it should do? And thinking about simple programs as kind of the basis for models of things. So I started studying these things get called cellular automata. And the idea is that thing at the bottom of the screen is kind of like a very simple program that just says if you have these cells and these particular arrangements, this is what you do next. You might say, well, it's a simple program. It makes a simple pattern. You go on, you try another program, also makes a simple pattern. You try another program, also makes a slightly more intricate, but still ultimately quite regular pattern. Well, then, back in 1981 or so, I tried the obvious computer experiment, which was just try running all possible rules of this kind and see what they do. Well, many of them do rather simple things. But the big surprise and kind of my all-time favorite science discovery is Rule 30. It has that little program at the bottom. But you start it off from just one black cell, and it makes this quite elaborate pattern. Keep going for a while. It produces a pattern that, for many practical purposes, looks completely random. You look at the center column in this pattern, it seems completely random. In fact, we used it for many years as the pseudo-random number generator in Mathematica and Wolfram language. Well, it's really a surprising thing. It's sort of a secret that nature seems to have that you can have a very simple program and yet it does complicated things. It's something out in the sort of computational universe. This is a kind of core phenomenon that even though the program is simple, the behavior may be complicated. And there are many consequences of this. Probably the most significant one is a thing that I call computational irreducibility, and it has to do with the following thing. Typically in sort of one of the achievements of exact science is let's make a prediction for what will happen in a system. Well, in this case, you can ask, well, what's going to happen after 1 billion steps in this particular, running this particular rule? And the surprising thing is that we have pretty good evidence that there's really no way to tell what will happen after 1 billion steps other than to run the thing for about 1 billion steps and see what happens. It's kind of you don't get to do that kind of jumping ahead that you expect in kind of exact science when you're sort of making a formula for something and concluding things from that. Well, so there's you can go and sort of explore the computational universe of possible programs, and I've spent a lot of time doing that, and it's kind of a very rich world of kind of what computation in the wild can do. And computation in the wild can do very, very elaborate things that are full of this phenomenon of computational irreducibility. Well, the other thing I've been interested in doing is figuring out how to take sort of the power of computation and humanize it, make it kind of accessible to humans. And sort of the big effort of my life, I suppose, has been building Wolfram language. And sort of the idea there, I'm not going to, I would naturally start doing some kind of demo, but I think I won't do that because we don't have time. But kind of the concept there is figure out, of all these things that are computationally possible, which things are ones that are relevant to us humans, and then try and identify those kind of lumps of computational work, implement them, and define kind of this computational language for describing the world in a computational way. I kind of see our mission as being kind of a version of what people did 500 years ago in the invention of mathematical notation. Before 500 years ago, you talked about math. It was done in terms of words and so on. Then mathematical notation, plus signs, equals signs, things like that were invented. Things got much more streamlined. It allowed algebra to be invented and calculus and so on. I view our mission now to be to try and create a kind of language, a computational language for describing things that allows sort of computational X for all X to be created. And we've spent the last, I don't know, 38 years or so building this. But let me talk about kind of some of the directions that I've gone, at least, in thinking about kind of what computation leads to. So once you know that a very simple rule can produce very complicated behavior, something like this Rule 30 or some other kind of rule, one of the questions that one might ask is, well, what about the whole universe? Maybe the whole universe is actually made from some very simple rule. I thought about that in the early 1990s. I made some progress on that, but then right in 2019, sort of as a result of first a quite technical advance, I kind of was able to make a lot more progress on that. It's sort of been an interesting thing that's kind of the result of my sort of life trajectory alternating between doing basic science and doing technology development, that's sort of built a tower of capabilities that I think allows one to do a project like the one that I was able to do. So the basic thing is that it seems like we've kind of figured out what the machine code of physics is like. And I should just sort of tell a historical story. If you go back to antiquity, people were arguing forever about whether the universe is discrete or continuous. And that argument continued through the 1800s. By the end of the 1800s, people had nailed it. Molecules existed. Matter was discrete. Likewise, you could think of light as discrete. At that time, beginning of the 20th century, most physicists believed that space was discrete as well. But nobody could make that work. And people like Einstein would say, you know, it will turn out to be discrete, but we don't have the tools to see how that works yet. Well, 100 years later, we do have some of those tools. And so the kind of starting point of our efforts to understand sort of the machine code of physics is the idea that space is ultimately discrete, and that really all there is in the universe is the structure of space. And everything that is kind of all particles and all those kinds of things are features of the structure of space. So in these models, a good way to think about space is it's some kind of hypergraph. It's a bunch of discrete elements, points in space, and they are related to each other. And all you know is how they are related. And they're related in a given point is related to other points. forming this kind of graph or hypergraph. And then the idea is that kind of the universe evolves by just rewriting this hypergraph, a little bit like cellular automata, except now there's no kind of fixed lattice of points. You just have this big floppy hypergraph that is being rewritten. So you start off with that hypergraph at the beginning there. These are just graphs, actually. Hypergraphs have more than two elements associated on a hyperedge. And you run it for a few steps, and you start getting more complicated kinds of things. You can get all kinds of structures. And the thing that happens is you can, from this, emerges something like space. And what turns out to be the case is just as you can start, as in those pictures that I was showing at the beginning, with a bunch of discrete molecules bouncing around, on a large scale, a bunch of discrete molecules bouncing around sort of limit to a continuum fluid kind of behavior. So the question is, what does a bunch of discrete hypergraph rewritings limit to? And it turns out, this is something I kind of found out in the 1990s, they limit to the Einstein equations. So that's already pretty interesting. And you can, but it's a sort of complicated situation because you don't even know what dimension the space is. All you know is that there are these points that are related to each other. So for example, let's say you have a rule like this. It'll sort of start knitting a space. In this particular case, it knits a very regular kind of space where you can kind of readily identify that looks like a two-dimensional kind of thing. You can do other kinds of things. You get sort of a curved two-dimensional kind of object. But in general, you can just say, well, I don't know what dimension this is going to make. How would I figure out what dimension the effective dimension of this hypergraph is? It's actually very straightforward. You just start at some point in the hypergraph, and you go at every step. You kind of go one unit away on the graph, and you see how big is this? What's the volume? What's the number of nodes contained in this ball that has gone r steps? If that grows like r to the d, you say it's roughly d-dimensional space. Well, so as I mentioned, kind of one of the big things is that you find out that you get the Einstein equations. We don't know that we get them in 3 dimensions. We can't derive the number 3. And figuring out what it means to have something like the Einstein equations in 3.2-dimensional space is an interesting piece of future mathematics, so to speak. I just might mention that when it comes to, when we talk about the structure of space being defined by this hypergraph, time is just the progressive rewriting of the hypergraph, the progressive kind of irreducible computation associated with the rewriting of the hypergraph. And you can kind of set up, it turns out things like relativistic invariance come out when you start thinking about every little rewriting is an event, and you find sort of the causal graph that connects all of those events, and you start to be able to say, well, how do we define sort of simultaneity surfaces like in relativity? You can do that by just looking at which events do you consider simultaneous. And we'll see pictures like this in a completely different domain in biology a bit later. So, okay, you do these things, and you can kind of see, this is just a little simulation of what sort of the very beginning of the universe in a model like this can look like. If you go a lot later in the history of the universe, you can make simulations like this. This is whoops, if I can bring it up. This is a couple of black holes. Black holes have the very nice feature that they're kind of scale invariant, so you can have a black hole that's only a small number of elementary lengths across, and those were 2 black holes merging, and you get nice gravitational waves produced that seem to agree quite well with the type of thing that happens with big black holes. Well, okay, so the first point here is that it seems that from sort of the large-scale behavior of this hypergraph rewriting is like the behavior of continuum space-time. So then the question, if you're sort of trying to say, well, does physics arise from this kind of low-level computational machine code? The next big thing that you come up with in physics is quantum mechanics. And it turns out in these models, quantum mechanics is actually quite inevitable. And the reason is that when you specify, we've got this hypergraph, we're going to rewrite the hypergraph. The question is, well, there may be many different places where the hypergraph can be rewritten. How do you deal with that? Well, the answer is that you can think about following all those possible paths of rewriting. You get what we call a multi-way graph, in which you say you have this hypergraph, and there are these many possible threads of time that get followed. And in a sense, the core difference between classical physics and quantum physics is that in classical physics, sort of definite things happen. In quantum physics, you have kind of the view that there are these many different threads of possibility, which then eventually we kind of knit together when we try and make a measurement or something. So in any case, it turns out that in these models, quantum mechanics is kind of inevitable, and sort of interesting that you get this kind of branching, merging sort of behavior of states. And one of the things that you can do is to say, well, how do we make a map of what states we get? We can kind of, oh, I didn't show this, okay. If you take kind of a slice across this picture, you can say, well, how are the states at that slice related to each other? And you make this thing, we call them branchial graphs, that represent kind of the relationships between these different branches. Okay, you take the limit of this branchial graph, you get this thing we call branchial space. And okay, here's where I think it gets really interesting. So in physical space, important phenomenon is gravity. And gravity in these models is associated with the idea that you have a shortest path, a geodesic, which you can define through this graph. And that geodesic is deflected by the presence of energy. And energy in these models turns out to be essentially the density of activity in the network. So you can sort of, the derivation of the Einstein equations is like that in physical space. In this branchial space, you can also ask things about deflection of geodesics and so on. And well, the sort of bottom line is, it seems like the Feynman path integral, which is kind of a mathematical foundation for quantum mechanics, the Feynman path integral is basically the same as the Einstein equations, except the path integral is played out in branchial space, and the Einstein equations are played out in physical space. So it's sort of a remarkable thing that the sort of the formalism of gravity is the same as the formalism of quantum mechanics in these models. Well, just to the sort of the deepest part of the rabbit hole that one gets to in these models is to say, okay, we've got this universe that's sort of computationally defined and it's specified according to some particular rule. You say, well, why that rule and not another rule? And so then you start thinking, well, what if the universe actually followed all possible rules? What would that be like? And so you can kind of ask, if you think about computational systems, you think about there's a little Turing machine rule, there's the Turing machine running. You can imagine a Turing machine that has several possible rules. You can imagine kind of building up this sort of collection of what happens with Turing machines with all possible rules. And the end result of this is to think about this object that we call the Roolead, which is the sort of entangled limit of all possible computational processes. So it's kind of a unique, sort of very abstract thing, and that we can think of that as being the result of physics running all possible rules. And you might say, well, what can you possibly say about this Roolead object? Well, the thing to realize is, as soon as you start realizing that we as observers of this thing are embedded within the Roolead, there start to be consequences of that you can deduce. Most important consequence is, if you make only some very basic assumptions about the way we are as observers, you immediately can conclude things about what we will perceive in this Roolead object. So the two most important assumptions are that we are computationally bounded and that we believe we are persistent in time. And the sort of big result, as far as I'm concerned, is that those two assumptions alone are sufficient to give us the structure of general relativity and the structure of quantum mechanics, which I find a remarkable thing, because it's kind of like you're able to actually sort of derive features of physics from just knowing things about the way that that we are as observers. Well, in any case, coming back to, let's see, coming back to, I could talk about how this relates to mathematics. Maybe if people are interested, I'll do that. But just coming back to statistical mechanics, one of the things that I, again, find pretty interesting is in the 20th century, there were sort of three big theories in physics: statistical mechanics, second law of thermodynamics, general relativity, and quantum mechanics. What seems to be the case is that all three of those theories actually come from the same origin, the same kind of computational origin. And in the second law of thermodynamics, kind of the big question is, well, you have some system of particles that starts in an orderly configuration, ends up producing apparent randomness. why is that happening? You can kind of sort of simplify that picture. Eventually, you might get some sort of one-dimensional picture like this, where you start off with something quite ordered, and it becomes quite disordered. But you kind of have to say, well, is it this picture is ultimately reversible? You can flip it upside down and run it backwards. You can say, when you are at one of these configurations where it looks kind of random, is it really random? Or does it just look random because you, as an observer of these things, are not capable of decoding what it's done? And effectively what happens is that the system is sort of encrypting its initial conditions, and because we are computationally bounded, we are not able to decrypt those initial conditions. We're not able to decrypt the state that we get to find out that it came from something simple. So in any case, this idea that we are sort of observers who have certain limitations, and that implies laws like that turns out it's the same story between all three of those basic theories of physics. So I was kind of happy 50 years after I got that book about which had the nice picture about statistical mechanics. I wrote this book last year, which kind of is green and looks a bit like the previous book, which I think is finally an understanding of how the second law works. All right, let me talk. I realize that I should go quickly because I really want to have time for lots of questions and so on. I could talk about kind of how this relates to, well, lots of things, but maybe something about mathematics. Let's talk about biology instead. This is a recent thing that I've done. Actually, I had started doing this in 1985. I was curious about whether one could have sort of a minimal model of biological evolution using things like cellular automata. And at the time, I had tried sort of starting off with some cellular automaton rule and saying, can I mutate that rule to get certain kinds of behavior? And I hadn't managed to make that work. But I didn't know about machine learning at that time. Well, I did know about neural nets, but I didn't manage to get them to do anything interesting. In modern times, we know that sort of if you bash a neural net hard enough, you can get it to do lots of different kinds of things. So I thought maybe I should try with these cellular automata, sort of bashing them harder and seeing if I can get them to kind of show biological evolution-like behavior. So this is a case where the rules are on the left. You start the thing off from just one red cell on the right. It runs for some number of steps and then dies out. Now you imagine making point mutations to those underlying rules, and you ask, can I make a series of point mutations so that I will achieve a particular purpose? So for example, one thing you might try to do is say, live as long as possible, but not for an infinite time. So what turns out to happen is that, yes, you can do that, and there are that's the sort of sequence of different phenotypes, so to speak, that you get from these different mutated genotypes evolving to the particular picture I showed at the beginning. Well, if you kind of roll the dice differently, you'll get that same structure, same type of rule, but it evolves in a different way. And it's kind of fun to think about these different sort of evolution paths and to say the thing had a particular idea about how to evolve. You know, we might have found a fossil that looked like that, and now it builds on that idea to produce the behavior that you see today. And if you look at, this is kind of a fitness, this is looking at the progression of fitnesses, looks very much like a loss curve in machine learning, except it's turned upside down, and there's a good reason for this. And so you see the red dots are kind of the attempts that were made to find successful sort of organisms, and the jumps up are where finally an idea was had, a breakthrough was made, and a more successful organism was produced. Well, this model is simple enough that you can kind of map out the complete structure of all possible evolution paths. And so you can kind of see on one side, it sort of has one idea about how to grow. On the other side, it has a different idea about how to grow. And the thing that, well, I just did yesterday, let me see if I can get you this picture. There we go. There's a much bigger version of this. That's for a slightly larger class of critters. And I find this sort of interesting because this is kind of a map of all possible evolution paths that could happen in this particular space of organisms. And the thing that I realized, there's another piece of it, I guess there's sort of a megafauna thing that showed up in the middle there. The thing that I sort of find interesting about this is a map of all possible evolution paths. And the question of what happens as you change, as you have different sort of fitness criteria for this system, is it's very much like what happens when you have these causal graphs of events and you ask, how are those events arranged in successive space-like hypersurfaces, in successive simultaneous time sequences of times? And so there's sort of this interesting analogy between the possible fitnesses and the possible, effectively, reference frames that you can use for space-time. And that was a thing I just realized yesterday. So and I think that's sort of interesting because it gives one kind of a handle on a more theoretical approach to things like biological evolution. I'll just mention, maybe I should just turn this over to questions. I could talk about some things to do with AI and some things to do with the foundations of mathematics, but maybe we should just find out what people want to hear about. That would be.
So we're going to take questions from each side. So raise your hand and I'll get to you. We'll start with Liam here.
Hi. First of all, this is fascinating, and I can't wait to read more. Second of all, I think, so one of the most important inventions of life, which I also myself research, is the process of endosymbiosis. And in general, symbiosis between two different systems that have their own evolutionary rules. I'm wondering if this tool could be used to predict how successful two systems would be in generating some type of symbiosis, and then is there a way to implement different constraints from the environment to assess that?
I don't know. The environment here is pretty simple. I have tried to look at things like sexual reproduction and to ask questions. So I haven't looked at anything to do with symbiosis. This is what's interesting about this is a very simple model, and I hadn't realized that a model this simple could give any of the kinds of features that one is interested in biological evolution. So I have to say that in, for example, sexual reproduction, I was surprised that it really gives one nothing very different. The model is more complicated. There are endless little sort of parameters to introduce and so on, but the end results are really no different. I don't know what happens when you combine two organisms. It's a good question. If you just take, two of these, if you either take it, okay, so one thing I was looking at very recently is the following thing. Can one find a sort of a foundational theory for things like medicine, which one would not think there might be a foundational theory for? But once you have this idea that you can have these kind of organisms that are evolved for a purpose, you can say, well, what happens if you poke the organism and perturb it in some way, and it then doesn't, does it still achieve its purpose? Does it still live a long life or whatever else? And what you can start to do is you can start to say, as you poke it, can you classify the possible diseases that can happen? Some it will recover from, some it will not, and so on. How does one think about that? Then how does one think about if one has perturbed it, can one make another perturbation to kind of heal that first perturbation? So I think there's sort of the possibility, which I hadn't really realized at all before, that you can make kind of a minimal formal theory of those kinds of processes. It's kind of like, you can do that for biological systems. You can also do that for computer systems, just like there's an ICD, classification of diseases for biological organisms. There are at least slight attempts to do the same kind of thing for diseases of computers, particularly for computer security purposes. And so there's sort of a question of can one, what commonality is there between the kinds of things that sort of go wrong with these minimal organisms, things that go wrong with computer systems. So that's at least the beginning of that. But this is sort of very new stuff of like the last month or so. So there's much to figure out, and I haven't, I've only just begun to scratch the surface of it.
Hi, a two-part question. First is viruses. What do you have to do to make it possible to define a virus in this? And is there like a minimal set of changes that you have to do in order to introduce the idea of viruses? And the second is immune response. Like, can you implement immune response? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, okay. So gosh, I don't know. Those are perfectly good questions. I mean, look, in terms of immune response, I think one of the things that's interesting, perhaps, is, in sort of one thing that's strange here is how diverse all these critters are. And that it's kind of like, you're making an antibody or something, and you're just changing a few peptides, and the thing ends up in a completely different shape with a completely different function. And this is sort of a minimal model of something like that. But I don't know how, the correspondence between, the space of shapes of proteins, antibodies, whatever, and this kind of thing, I don't know. You guys are asking about things I've just worked on the last month or two. So, please.
So I have two questions that are maybe related. The first one is sort of a philosophical point, which is you mentioned this idea of computational irreducibility. And so I wonder, is the message of that really that our quest to understand things in science in a sort of parsimonious way, is that quest misguided? And then the second question is more concrete. So you mentioned this Rullion thing, and you mentioned that there are a couple assumptions you need to make about us as observers. And that one of these is that we believe we persist through time. I think that's what you said. So yes. What does that actually mean formally? And like, what do these anthropic principle type things have to do with our doing science in the universe?
Okay, so first thing about computational irreducibility. Yes, computational irreducibility is an example, is something that shows limitations of science. I mean, we've been running for the last 300 years or so on the idea that, yes, you can just write down an equation and it'll tell you how the universe is going to work. That's not going to continue always working. That's sort of the bad news. The good news is, in a sense, that computational irreducibility is sort of what makes existence meaningful in the following sense. If everything we did was just, we could know what was going to happen, the answer is going to be 42 or whatever, there would be nothing achieved by the passage of time. Computational irreducibility kind of shows that something is sort of rigidly achieved by the passage of time. So I think that's sort of the trade-off. Now, there are many implications of computational irreducibility. I mean, one for sort of AI kinds of things is the following. Let's say, we now are in a situation where actually, I should show something about that. Yeah. So we're sort of now in a situation where, we have had a period post-industrial revolution when the machines we make, we expect to understand. That is presumably coming to an end. And the thing is, we then have a choice. Do we want the things we make to be sort of doing their computational best, which means they will be doing irreducible computation, or do we want them to be constrained to do only the things that we want them to do, so to speak? You kind of have this trade-off. You can force the thing to be computationally reducible, so you know what all the pieces do, and you can know that it will only do the things you want it to do, or you can allow it to do to sort of achieve as much as it can computationally, in which case you have to have computational irreducibility, and you necessarily have sort of unexpected things happening. I want to show something, which was that one of the things I was doing very recently was looking at sort of the foundations of machine learning. So typical neural net, you give it an input at the top, it produces an output at the bottom, it's trained to produce that function on the right. So what I was curious about is what happens when you don't want to make something as complicated as this. It's hard to visualize what happens inside neural nets. Can you make something where you just have, for example, a grid of cells, a grid of neurons? The answer is yes. Can you even go further than that and make make the neural net out of a collection of discrete cells? And so this is an example of kind of a very minimized, kind of Booleanized neural network in which you have just two possible rules that you can run at every cell, and then you're asking, can you make the neural net? Can you kind of evolve a neural net? This is a very simplified neural net that will achieve some particular purpose. So in this particular case, the purpose being achieved was live for 50 steps and then die out. And so the pattern, the background pattern, is the kind of the configuration of what you can think of as weights, although they're just Boolean values, that achieves that. And so, you can work out sort of fitness functions and so on. It's very much like that biological evolution that I showed you before. Sort of the biological evolution in neural net terms is like a very recurrent neural net. This is more like a traditional feed-forward neural net that just has where you're just feeding data through this series of layers with different weights. One of the things that is interesting is if you say, well, what is the neural net doing? How is it doing how is it achieving the purpose that you've trained it to achieve? And the answer is it's pretty complicated. It's not, sometimes there's kind of a simple explanation that you can have, but a lot of times the kind of the actual structure of what's going on in the neural net is really complicated. So one of the things that I've been curious about is kind of what is the qualitative picture of what's happening inside a neural net, for example? How should we think about that? And my favorite analogy in recent times is if you're building a wall, there are sort of a couple of approaches you can take. You can engineer it by building a bunch of bricks and then carefully arranging the bricks. You get a wall that way. Another possibility is you can see a bunch of rocks lying around on the ground, and you can build a stone wall by finding sort of which rock fits into which kind of gap that's left. And you can successfully build a wall, at least of a certain height, by doing that. And I think machine learning is basically doing something like that. It's taking lumps of irreducible computation and finding ones that happen to fit and putting them together in such a way as to achieve something that we consider useful. Which means that, for example, if you want to say, well, why is the neural net, why is the machine learning system doing what's happening inside, there may be no kind of simple narrative explanation, because it's just, well, there were these lumps of irreducible computation that happen to be able to fit together in this particular way. So I think we're exposed to computational irreducibility a lot in the modern world of AI, and I think kind of some kind of big decisions that people sort of have to make is, do you want the computationally reducible version that is limited in what it can do, but will only do the things you want it to do, or are you prepared to have the irreducible version which will do lots of interesting things, including some things you may not want? And it's kind of like, we are pretty used to living around computational irreducibility because we live around nature, which is full of that kind of thing. And we've sort of found these particular paths for existing in the natural world where we can sort of happily exist, even though there are these sort of irreducible computations that are happening. So the second thing you were asking was about kind of our characteristics as observers. And so the computational boundedness part is you can already see that in the second law of thermodynamics, because it's kind of like, it's what prevents us from essentially decoding the dynamics that's going on underneath and knowing, oh, this particular complicated configuration of molecules necessarily came from this simple thing. It's, in the formalism of statistical mechanics, there's been lots of confusion about coarse graining and what counts as a valid coarse graining and so on. And this is kind of a computational characterization of that. The thing about persistence in time, it's not at all obvious that, so one feature of us as kind of human observers is we believe we have a sort of coherent thread of experience through time. And when there's quantum mechanics involved and there are many threads of time, it's not at all obvious that we should have a single coherent thread of experience through time. And when we think about sort of us being made of these atoms of space that are in these different configurations and so on, it's not at all obvious that the configuration of atoms of space at one moment of time will give us sort of the same us at a subsequent moment of time. So it's an assumption that we are making as observers that it's sort of the same us going through time. And by the way, in the case of quantum mechanics, sort of the interesting thing is that when you imagine sort of the insides of a quantum computer, it's got these multiple threads of history, which you could imagine would be doing sort of different parts of some non-deterministic computation or something like that. But then, because we humans believe in this sort of single thread of experience, in order for us to make use of this quantum computer, we have to have all those threads kind of knitted together to a single kind of conclusion. And that's sort of the place where there's a big question which is not really addressed in quantum mechanics in its traditional formalism of sort of how much effort does it take to knit together all those threads of experience, of history, to get this kind of, so there's a bunch to say about that. One of the things that I'm very interested in is sort of experimental implications of our physics project and things like, how can we detect discreteness in space and so on. Some of the effects that you see are things like dimension fluctuations. The universe does not have to be precisely three-dimensional, so you can have regions of 3.01 dimensional space and so on. It's an interesting physics problem. What does photon propagation look like through a region of 3.01 dimensional space? Not yet solved. I'm also, one of my sort of suspicions is that there's, when you look at among sort of, there are features of physics that we have known for a long time, which are actually will eventually be seen as symptoms of the discreteness of space. So my favorite is actually dark matter. And I kind of see the following analogy. Back in the 1800s, when people were thinking about heat, they thought, well, heat flows. So what do we know that flows? Oh, it's a fluid. So they invented caloric fluid. Turns out that wasn't the right theory of heat. Heat is microscopic motion of atoms and so on. Well, I suspect dark matter may not be matter at all, but instead something like space-time heat, so to speak, a feature of the kind of microscopic structure of space. So in any case, and in quantum computers, I have this suspicion that a bunch of the noise that is seen in quantum computers is actually a sign. I'm kind of hoping that the engineering of quantum computers has been done so well that if one plots out the right things, one will actually see kind of a noise floor that is associated with a thing that in our models we call the maximum entanglement speed, which is the analog of the speed of light in branchial space, which would be very cool because if we can find that, we would have sort of, we may or may not have the same luck that people had at the beginning of the 20th century when it turned out the molecules were big enough that you could actually observe them with instruments that existed at that time. We may or may not have the same luck now, and that's one of the possible ways that one could get to that. But I think one feature of there are parts, as I say, the really surprising thing is that the core characteristics of general relativity and quantum mechanics and statistical mechanics seem to depend only on these very loose properties of us as observers. And my guess is that other things, like the fact that we perceive space as three-dimensional, are features that have to do with more detailed properties of us as observers, haven't figured out, and they'll probably be very obvious once we see them. And that's one of the things still to figure out.
Okay, we have time for only one more question. Is there one on that side of the room?
Hi, I want to go back to something you said a little while ago about the implications of computational irreducibility for AI. So I work in a space where we're trying to use AI to design molecules that we can then validate in the lab. And I'm really frustrated by the suggestion that this is completely irreducible because like most scientists that I work with want some physical explanation for why those molecules were correct. So is it that the AI is just going through so much randomness and so much complexity that it's just luck, or are there like really, or are the molecules we're getting out really aligning with like the physics that we know?
Well, I mean, so the question is, why do sort of LLM-based protein folding models, why do they work? And that's I'm curious about that because, at the beginning, what was happening was, you take the protein data bank, you do multiple sequence alignment, you can find that the protein you're looking for, pieces of it fit things that were already known, and then kind of the machine learning part of it was kind of fitting together those pieces that were already known. When you have a completely ab initio, here's a random sequence of peptides, how will it fold up? It is, I think it's completely unclear whether that produces a sensible result. And my guess is that it doesn't. I think that this question of whether there is a correspondence, I did a little study of this, whether there's sort of a correspondence between what happens in, can you get AI to basically reproduce, let's see if I can find something here. Let's see. Can you get AI to sort of successfully reproduce, or can you get a neural net to successfully reproduce something that would otherwise come from physics equations? And actually, it doesn't work very well at all. I mean, this is an attempt with various neural nets to reproduce a sine curve. And after, the region on the left, it was trained for, the region on the right is an extrapolation, and it does horribly. And it basically, even as you increase the size of the network, it doesn't do any better. And so you can ask, for example, one of those cellular automaton things, you can say, well, can a nice modern transformer network, can it successfully predict what's going to happen in one of these patterns. Well, if the thing is periodic, yes, it does fine. If the thing is more complicated, it does not do very well. You can do the same thing for, let's see if I can find this. You can do the same thing for like the three-body problem. You can say, can it do the equivalent of solving the equations for motion of three bodies under gravity? And the answer is when the bodies are behaving in a fairly simple way, it does fine. When it's more complicated, it doesn't do very well. And you can do the same thing. It's kind of fun that there's some proteins. Yeah, there we go. There are some proteins where one of those is the prediction from LLM models. The other is the crystallographic, I think it's crystallographic data. And what you see typically is that, I'm not sure if this is that the right, there's a decent example. What you see is, you have an alpha helix that's behaving in a fairly simple way. It will do a pretty good job of reproducing it. When it's a big globular mess, it doesn't do a terribly good job of reproducing it. And I think that's, it is finding kind of pieces of reducibility in these structures. I don't think when there's truly kind of irreducible stuff going on, I don't think it's just not in the nature of these things to be able to do that. I mean, this is a very practical point is, what will LLMs be able to do versus what do you need computation to do? I mean, in our sort of business, we're in the business of trying to figure things out with computation. And the question is, when do you end up using computation? When do you end up being able to sort of just go through the layers of an LLM to get a result? And I think the sort of the emerging kind of technology connection is what we're calling computational augmented generation, which is kind of the analog of retrieval augmented generation. But computational augmented generation means you're an LLM and you're producing output, and you're basically using computation to fuel the output you're generating. And there are things where you kind of have to use actual computation, and there are cases where you can just use the LLM. And I mean, I think the thing about neural nets, when a neural net's going to work? Well, they work on a lot of things which are human-like tasks, and they probably distinguish cats from dogs in kind of the same way that humans do, because they work kind of like humans work. Now, when you're doing some problem in physics about proteins, there is no kind of human angle to that. So it's much less clear what's going to happen. I mean, I think the only thing that is a little bit tricky is when you're looking at a protein, there are sort of features of that protein that we humans tend to pick out, like, oh, there's a beta sheet here. And insofar as you're saying, look, this neural net did really well, it picked out these same kinds of features, that's again something where you're injecting kind of a human angle into what's going on. But I think, I don't think that the idea that, neural nets are going to take over from computation or physics and be able to figure out things that are, I think computational irreducibility kind of shows you what the limits are to what you can expect to be able to do with a neural net that is effectively doing a limited amount of computation. Yeah.
So you've created, of course, a magnificent body of code over decades to produce what your software does. Thinking today with your most practical hat on, how much of it could be done much more simply today using neural networks? That sort of gets to the practical result.
Right. I think very little. So I mean, for years, we've used, so like when we first started building Mathematica, I remember people said, I wanted to evaluate all special functions, hundreds of special functions to arbitrary precision anywhere in the complex plane. And people said, you're crazy. They said, by the end of the 1990s, we'll have the integer order Bessel functions to quadruple precision. And so what did we do? Well, we built the system that just searched through sort of possible rational approximations to these functions. We did what today would be called machine learning. And we spent many months of CPU time and got good results. So we've done many of those kinds of searches for algorithms. And I've been doing that for years. Searches for algorithms work quite well. So that's a definite thing. Now, in terms of, can one sort of improve? OK, so one thing I'll show you. I've got to show you one little demo. Let's see what I can pull up here. Let's see. Do I really want to live dangerously and try some demo that? This is very new stuff, but this is I don't know, what's a good, I don't know, compute a, I don't know, eigenfunction for an ellipse. Let's try that, see what happens here. I think this may be a disaster, but no, it's not looking good. Not looking good at all. Well, let's see. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's not terrible. That's not terrible. Wow, it knows about Mathieu functions. That's a good start. Wow. Okay, that's more complicated. Wow, well, look at that. Not terrible. So, you know, this is sort of an example of, this is an example of something somewhat interesting, which is we've given it some vague thing to do. It's produced something in precise computational language. Chances are, you know, I can more or less read this, and I think this collaboration between the human and the AI of you say some vague thing, it produces something that is a piece of precise computational language. I mean, this wouldn't work with a low-level programming language because you get a big blob of code which most people couldn't read. Kind of the idea is this is sort of high enough level that a human can read it, a human can take those kind of building blocks and go from there. I think that's the most sort of powerful connection. I don't think taking big chunks of algorithmic code and replacing it with neural nets, I don't think that's I mean, we've already done a lot of searching for algorithms and so on, so it's not, you know, the things that we use for, I don't know, solving differential equations and so on, those were found by searchers. The algorithms were found by searchers. So that's a comparable technology. You know, right now, you know, lots of things we've done experiments with for ages, like neural nets versus finite element methods, still not really working well. But that's so I don't think the idea of, I mean, the thing is, this notion of, you know, just tell the AI to write code and the code will magically get written. The main problem is, what do you want the code to do? You have to have some specification for that. And, you know, that's what I've been trying to build for a long time, is a good notation for specifying what you actually want the code to do. And that's kind of the approach.